Welcome to Everything's Not Black and White, a podcast about perspectives with your hosts, Lala and Brian. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. We are so excited to have one of the sweetest, most endearing, compassionate, energetic, wonderful people that I know. I'm so proud to call her friend, and she's been a mentor and a coach to me. She is quite a human being. This is Suzanne Roberts. She is an amazing leader here in the Columbus, Ohio community, and she has a lot of passion around equality, justice, especially when it comes to race relations, and she has made it a personal mission of hers to really bring awareness around race. And she is one of my heroes, and I'm so excited for Brian and I to welcome her to the EMB podcast. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be here.
So we're very excited to have you kind of share a little bit about your story and how you got to this work. So tell us a little bit of how you grew up and like in what era it was, and like what did you experience as a young person?
So I was born in 1952, and I grew up in Bexley, Ohio, which is a middle to upper middle class kind of exclusive neighborhood that especially back then was white, and the only people of color that we saw or I saw were either helping people's homes or in the cafeteria. There certainly weren't any faces of color in the school at all. So one of the things that shaped me in even understanding that race exists is when I was young. I was 4 years old, and we went to Little Rock, Arkansas, my family, and my father had been in the Army, and one of his Army mates was from Little Rock. They were both doctors, and I remember this white house with pillars, and I ran down the hill in the back because I was adventurous and curious, and ended up what I know now playing with the help children. I didn't understand that back then. But the driveway went down this hill, and there was a garage at the bottom, and I just remember playing with the kids, and I heard the dinner bell, and I ran with the kids into it was like a room underneath the garage because it was on a hill. And I can't promise you this is exactly true, but it seemed like there was a dirt floor and a light hanging from the ceiling that was kind of swaying, and it was like a vibrant, spirited place that, also had smell of the earth. And then all of a sudden, somebody grabbed me and pulled me out of there and said, "You don't belong there," and started marching me up the hill. And I just remember as I was being pulled up the hill looking back, because I wanted to go be where I found the life to be and what felt right to me. And as I was walking up the hill, it was like walking into white supremacy, the White House on the hill in the South, disregard to where the conditions of the help were. And I felt this cold chill come over me. And then I just remember sitting at the dinner table, just having this, it wasn't like a cognitive thought, but just the awareness of how unconscious everybody was around me. And then I also learned to silence myself, which is what I think white supremacy and white privilege asks white people to do, is to silence themselves about the egregiousness and the harm of systemic racism. So that was in me. And then in second grade, there was a Black family that moved into Bexley, and I played with the kid, and someone called my parents' house and told them that I played with a Black child and that I should never do that again. And I didn't understand it. And then the family was gone. And once again, I just went silent and numb. But everything felt wrong to me. But I just knew to belong, I'd have to go silent and numb until I got older. And then, like, the numbing started wearing off, and then it just became intolerable. Yeah. I'm not saying there isn't numbness in me around white supremacy, because I've been trained that way. but I actively worked to unnumb myself.
You said you were born in 52. My mom was born in 51, and she grew up in the deep South as well, down in South Georgia. And so I'm thinking about her describing her teenage years, which were right in the thick of the civil rights movement, and all of the things that happened where she absolutely could not sit at lunch counter. She could not ride the front part of the bus. She couldn't have certain jobs and had to go to segregated schools. I know that happened in Georgia, and I know said you were in Little Rock at 4 years old, but what was the environment like in Bexley during the civil rights movement that you can remember?
I remember in my own home, my mother talking to my parents were divorced, but my mother, talking to us about how awful it was, what was going on. And I do remember Selma, and I remember Ruby Sales. I remember when the man went in front of her and took the bullet. I remember, but it wasn't through the community of Bexley. It was only in my own home. I don't remember hearing about it at school. I remember writing about it and having my teacher not even respond to the content of what I wrote, and only to my grammar.
Wow.
Redlining was a big deal in Bexley. Did you recognize in your school that there was this black and white difference in the community?
I didn't get any education in Bexley about civil rights or racism or the history of, I didn't learn about the 3/5 human until I was an adult. I didn't get any of the education about systemic racism and how our country was built and how racism operates in every level. And, I didn't have any exposure to any of that until I was an adult. And to me, that's such a horrible thing.
Yeah.
To not have information is just horrible.
I agree with you. Growing up here in Groveport, Ohio, which is a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, if you wanted to have any knowledge about Black history, you had to stay after school to take an African American history class. It was never taught in our social studies class.
Right.
So at what point in time did you said there's a point when you felt like you couldn't be silenced or numb anymore? Like, what was the spark that kind of got you to kind of see things differently and feel like you had a voice to speak up?
I think there were a couple of things. I was doing a lot of work around empowering women and girls, and in that process, I wanted to make my public courses diverse. Here's something I want to say. There's something about wanting to be a good person, which is different than doing the deep work around how white supremacy gets institutionalized inside of each one of us and deeply into our unconscious and our nervous system. I had one or two African American women enroll in the classes. I remember one woman came to me and said, "I'm with white people all day long. I don't want to come do this. I'm exhausted." And it just, all of a sudden, it hit me that this was deeper than my do good thing of wanting to have equity in my classes. It was like, what's the privilege I get to rest in, and what's the exhaustion that people of color have to face on a daily basis? And listening to her, then I felt something that started waking it up inside me. And then I also realized this is going to require work inside of me, and then also me to take a stand. Like, if I do want diversity in the room, then I have to have 50%. I have to have my teaching team be 50%, and then I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make that happen. So then it was keep working on how does privilege play out inside of me, and how blinded am I to so many things. And then the more I just started really digging inside my own self to do my own unnumbing and reading a lot and doing my own work around it. And then race became so evident in me that is the thing that I want to focus on for the rest of my life.
So when you were going through this work and you said, okay, I need to understand more about race, and where I sit in the world. Like, what did you discover about yourself? Because I think a lot of people tend to, when something starts to hurt or feel uncomfortable, they want to shy away from it, when sometimes you got to lean into it. So what was it that you were finding out about yourself, and how you mentioned how we all are programmed with certain ways? Like, what did you find out about yourself, and what did you do about it when you found it?
I think I took the time to let myself feel the pain, watch really painful things, actually. Like 12 years a slave, 13th, that really feel it, and let myself unnumb from the numbing that white supremacy asks us to do and white privilege asks us to do, so we don't have to care, and find a way to depersonalize. Like, I didn't create it, and yet I'm still accountable to it. How can I learn how to do that without feeling like guilty or shame about it, but to look at, like, how is this playing out? How is racism playing out at every single level in our country, and really looking at it from poverty to education to who's represented at what level in organizations, and to infant mortality. It doesn't matter, to everything. No matter what you look at, it's everywhere. And I just made myself look and look and look and take the blinders off, and then start admitting that whether I like it or not, I've been trained to be racist, and to not let my feeling of I'm a good person override what's in the back of my head. Just admitting to myself that what are the things, associations I'm going to have when I see a person of color? Like, what are the things that are going to come to mind, whether I want them to or not, and let them come to mind so that they don't rule me unconsciously.
Made some great points, especially when it comes to what we as white people pretty much see on TV. It is what conditions us. Nowadays, shows like 48 Hours, which is homicide documentaries, almost all the people that get shot or killed are the victim or the shooter is a black person. Even in today's television, it still kind of corrupts the perception of what is reality in the black community. And unfortunately, you as well as I, sometimes you get that feeling if you see someone walking up and they're black, and you have to recondition yourself, like you said, to say, why am I judging like that? Why am I looking like that? Because your first impulse should not be your last impulse. You should be able to recognize and say, hey, that's not right. It wasn't until I met my wife that I really started opening my eyes to different things in different ways. Some of the movies that you talked about, also like Hidden Figures and The Green Book, there was terminology in there, such as sundown towns. I had no idea what that was. So I actually took the time to look up sundown towns and looked up in the state of Ohio which towns were sundown towns. And I was shocked that there was quite a few of them. But going back to the history part of it, we're not taught that. So in order to have, if you have an investment in it like I do with my wife and my daughter, now I have an investment in it and I'm around it all the time. Now I want to know, well, what's going on? So I think you make a great point with the way we are conditioned and the way we are taught and we're programmed, and we have to re-hardwire ourselves sometimes to get back on point.
So, Suzanne, one of the things that I think you did that was so beautiful, and it really helped open up a lot of people's eyes, is that you started a conversation with a gentleman, Jim White, and you had a thing called Safe Conversation Around Race. And so can you talk to my listeners about what that was?
Yeah, so a friend of mine kept talking about Jim to me and me to Jim, and we ended up meeting, and Jim is an African-American man who has a great TED Talk, and he and I would meet and for hours talk about racism, and he would ask me questions that he would wanted to ask white people that he felt safe asking me, and we would unpack things together. Like, we would talk about what it's like to not feel safe and to have to armor up all the time and have a presentation for him, and what's that cost to him, and could he armor down at the end of the day and find a way to rest for himself? Or, he would ask me, why do I care? Or why do white people not care, when he has to think about it all the time? So one day I said to him, Jim, if we can have these really in-depth and hard conversations together in a really humane and respectful way, if people could listen to us, maybe they could do it. You know, what part of what's hard is that we're so segregated. I think Columbus is the fifth most segregated city economically and racially. And if we're not rubbing up against each other, we can't humanize each other, right?
Right.
And so if we can be in the room together and talk to each other and be in this conversation together, we'll build something. We're not trying to break, we're not trying to hurt each other. We're trying to build a different kind of humanity together.
Audience, and I'm sure most of you have probably heard this already, the story about Ahmaud Arbery, who was running in a neighborhood and was gunned down by a father and a son, simply because of his color. Honestly, when it comes down to it, it's because he was black. And there was a story put around it that they thought he was a burglar. He might have been stealing things, but a very shocking video was recently leaked, and because of that, it brought a lot of national attention, international even attention to this case, whereas they had not been charged or arrested, and it happened on February 23rd, and it's in the almost middle of May, and nothing had happened, and that's it's an intense, it actually tore me up this whole week. I've been crying and trying to make peace with this happening, and I just can't. It is so disturbing to me on so many levels.
And what makes it even sadder is we've had this scenario before multiple times, and Trayvon being just recently, where all they have to do is quit following them, call the police, and let the police deal with the situation, and none of this would have happened. These over-aggressive, aggressive people that are going after, thinking they could do vigilante justice on their own is just uncalled for.
Yeah.
Does that have any echoes in your past living in the South and being brought up in the South?
Oh, most definitely. I grew up in a little town, Sylvania, Georgia, which is not that far from Brunswick, where this situation happened. And I remember, growing up, the Ku Klux Klan had a regular annual parade and march in our town. And, our town was pretty segregated. Blacks lived on their side and whites lived on their side. And we just knew when the Ku Klux Klan was in town, we just don't go downtown. Make sure you have your groceries and everything you need, because you just don't go downtown. There are things even until I was in high school. I was a freshman in high school before we actually integrated our homecoming dances and proms. And that was in the late 80s. So it wasn't just in the 60s, the civil rights movement. There were a lot of things that continued to happen in the South. And I think Brian and I have read there were cases of high schools that still were segregated well into almost the early 2000s. So, I just don't understand this thing of, because it's never been separate but equal. It's never been equal. It's always been separate, but it's never been equal.
My question to all of us is, what is it that will wake people up?
That's a great question.
Oh,
gosh. What does it take?
Right.
Me personally, I think it takes exposure. I think white people that have not been around black people need to be around more than just one black friend. There's millions of black people around in this country, and people have to associate with different cultures in different ways.
We were doing working with senior executives at Ohio Health, and I say the token white person on the panel. And I remember one of the executives who had driven from Dublin to the Martin Luther King Library and had never, ever been to that part of town. I don't think had driven by a house that was boarded up or seen people that didn't look like him so much in the library. And he's like, I just drive down the freeway into the parking garage and go into work to the, senior levels, and just had never seen. So part of it is like, what if people had to send their kids to an inner city school and saw the lack of resources and the trauma that goes on in an inner city school and the poverty and all that? Would they care then? I don't know but I do think if people know someone and they're hurt, and I think that happened, I'm not sure if I have the story exactly right, but the a previous CEO of Ohio Health, one of his executive friends is a black man who got threatened by the police, and it hit him finally. You know, maybe if we know someone who's been egregiously wronged or the situation right now, can it help us wake up and fight harder and care more and use our voices and maybe be more bold and brave to take a stand? But I think we need experience. I think we need our hearts broken open. I think we need to be touched, and I don't know how to have that happen. I do know that in the safe conversations about race, we'd have about 150 people in the room, and it was about 50% diverse. And I do feel like I saw people changing because we were in there together just talking about the thing that feels so hard to talk about and saying that nothing horrible is happening, you know,
Right.
And I also think, like, because I know that I say, like, I'm racist, and Jim will say, you're the least racist person I know. And I go, but I've been conditioned to be racist since the day I was born. And if I don't admit it, then it will win over me. If I can say I was trained to be racist, then I have a choice.
Right.
And I remember a lot of white people would buck up against me about that. And then but something in them, I saw people change. I did.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of people out there who don't know what they don't know, but once they get their eyes opened, they really do want to make change. You know, I sat in many of those audiences with you and Jim, and I had conversation with the people around me, and there were some genuine people, and there were lots of tears that were flowing that people said, I no longer want to be a part of a racist system. And I said, good, let's change together, you know, and that's the thing. You have to acknowledge it and say, I'm going to be different. I'm going to make a change, and I'm going to be one person for right now. And I'm going to try to bring as many people along with me as I can.
Yeah, I found that when Lala and I both attended your one session, it was a much more intimate. I think we had maybe 10 people there. So it felt good to be in there and be able to talk, being a white guy, with such a diverse audience and hear their stories and have them hear my stories and get some affirmation and some positivity out of it. And I really want to thank you for that. So I really enjoyed that. And I've actually asked other family members next time that possibly occurs that maybe I'll bring them along so they can at least listen if they don't want to say anything, because I think there's so much you can learn by communicating, and you're providing that with your Big Table program, some of the other programs you're doing, and it's a great thing to have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Lala, what do you think it will take for people to wake up and care and want to be different?
I think really it's about being able to humble yourself. I think we all have a way that sometimes we want to be right and think that the way we think is the right way and the only way. So I think when you humble yourself and say, I don't know this, or I may be wrong about this, because nobody wants to be wrong, I think that opens a door. When you have that vulnerability and that humility, it opens a door for you to actually let your guard down and learn. And it also helps you be able to see different people's perspectives. And I would hope that people start to do that more, to be more vulnerable and say, you know what, this hurts me, and I'm going to tell you why it hurts me, and give people a little bit of an insight into your experience and your history. You know, I did a lot of that this week, just talking to people about how I grew up and why his story was so just like ripping my heart out, because I grew up there. And so all these memories of being discriminated against and the Ku Klux Klan just came flooding back to me. And so I had to tell people, I'm taking this really hard because of this. And so a lot of people really rallied around me, and they're like, I could never understand that because I've never experienced that, but I want to be here for you. So tell me how to be there for you. So I think there's humility on both sides of the race. Like, as a Black woman, I want to help people understand where I've come from, but in also knowing that this younger generation won't have had the same experiences I have had, and to the same degree. Right. So really helping them see me and I see them, and we have conversation. You know, that's the one thing I think Brian and I have had such a wonderful time in our marriage, is really having deep conversations about how we've grown up, how we experience the world, and helping to see things through each other's eyes. And that's what it's going to take for people to be able to move the needle, is that, number one, we have to look at each other as humans first. And then second of all, we have to be willing to humble ourselves and hear someone else's perspective and know that we're not always going to be the right one in the conversation.
You know, Lala, you said something that really struck me. You said, to see each other as human. And I think for me, then how do I the inflated two fists more? How do I deflate that two fists more? And then how do I then afford the five fists of full humanity to a race of people and uplift their humanity?
Yes.
And that requires conscious work.
Hard work too, emotional work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, one of the things like Jim and I talk about, or sometimes Maurice and I do some work around white privilege. Maurice is also a man of color. We talk about how each race is asked to numb in their own way. Or, I think about, like, as a woman of color walking into white rooms often, what that's like,
Done it a lot in my life.
Right. And what is that like?
It makes me feel like I have to be the best possible version of myself, because I can't afford for anyone to look at me like a stereotype, because then that would hold the rest of my race hostage. I think about that all the time. It's hard for me in my old corporate life to let my guard down, because anything that would be conceived as negative or negative toward my race, I was extremely conscious of. And so I tried always to be, quote unquote, to my best behavior. And I couldn't look anything like they would think I'm supposed to do because I'm Black. And so it was exhausting, to be honest.
Right. No, for sure. And not even gender alone. You have to prove yourself twice as hard, but you put race and gender together, you have to work 50 times as hard.
Yeah, it's exhausting. Yes.
To prove that you have a right to be there, right? And
right.
And then the burden of carrying it for your whole race, like, that's exhausting.
Yeah, it's very, very hard.
Yeah, that's one thing I never really thought about until I met her, and she works in the corporate world, and understanding how much pressure she puts on herself to carry the torch for the next person coming along. That's not something typically a white person would even think about or cross their mind. But being around her and seeing the frustration and just the pressure she puts on herself to be the best example she can be is tremendous. And I don't know how you move forward with that. That's got to be extremely a big weight for you to carry all the time.
Yeah, it's a weight I think probably most people of color feel that way, but I think particularly women of color feel that way.
There's that John Henry effect where they've done research for high performing and high achieving people of color in a more white world, the cost mentally, physically, and emotionally, that they can actually measure it, the stress of it.
Wow. Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. It is quite a bit that affects you on so many levels. So, Suzanne, if we had people or white people, men or women, who are listening to this podcast and they say, I want to do something, I want to get started, and I want to make a difference, what are one or two things that you think they can do right now that can help them change the way race is seen and felt in this world?
I'm going to give three things.
Okay, I like three.
One is I would read the book So You Want to Talk About Race. I think it's absolutely a comprehensive book and uncomfortably easy to get through. I think in terms of everybody says, well, what action can I take? Go support a Black-owned business. When Martin Luther King was looking at an economic justice policy, he wasn't looking at just people of color. It was a justice for all. But one of the things is put your dollars to help lift up communities that need lifted. So that's an action anyone can take. I think the other thing is look at every situation as an opportunity to leverage your privilege. And that can come in many formats, whether I pull my car over, if I'm not on the freeway, if I police with a person of color just to see if I should need to take a video or, just to make sure things are copacetic. That's something I personally do. I also will take a stand about making sure that if I'm working with an organization, that people hire people of color at all levels of the organization to challenge how many people they have at an entry level and to do an audit. And there's lots of different ways. Or if you see somebody treat a person of color differently in a store, speak up.
Mm-hmm.
We're not, as one individual, going to be able to solve the whole system of racism, but we can do small things every day.
I really appreciate this conversation with you, Suzanne, because I know I talk to a lot of people who are well-meaning, and they'll say, well, I know I'm a good person and I don't do anything that's blatantly racist, and so I think I'm not a part of the problem. But when you sit and watch racism and you do nothing about it, you absolutely become part of the problem. And you just become complicit with sitting there and doing nothing. And we need people to take action. It's right. Yeah. So I'm hoping that people who are listening now can feel empowered to do something, where after they hear this, they'll want to do something to help make a change. And I think even one person at a time, it starts a domino effect, and we start multiplying it. And then next thing you know, we have a movement. And that's exactly how things change. They change through movements.
Right.
So we're just honored. Absolutely. And we love you so much, and we thank you for spending this beautiful time with us.
Yeah,
it
love
is
you
our
both.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, it's been great, and we appreciate everything you've had to share with us today. It speaks volumes.
Yep. And so for our listeners, if you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us at enbwpodcast@gmail.com. That's enbwpodcast@gmail.com. And Suzanne, would you welcome anyone to get in touch with you?
Absolutely.
So how can they do that?
Suzanne, SUZANNE, at unifingsolutions.com.
Awesome. Well, we thank you
Alrighty.
again so much.
Thank you. Love you.
Love you, dear.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
We'll see you next time.
Alrighty. Thank you.
Alrighty.
Bye-bye.
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 This has been Everything's Not Black and White, a podcast about perspectives with your hosts, Lala and Brian, a production of LBB Edutainment.